Okay, so let's give this another go. What I hope the games that we have played have demonstrated is that this deck has essentially two halves to it. It has the parts of the deck that are all about acceleration, which is Jaspera Sentinel, Magda, Prosperous Innkeeper, Professional Facebreaker, sort of Goldhound, and then Ranger class, Goldhound, and all the other cards in combination with Facebreaker. All of those cards are the acceleration half of the deck. And at least Jaspera Sentinel, Prosperous Innkeeper, and Magda, we literally never cut. Facebreaker, we essentially never cut. There are possibilities that it's worth cutting one against Esper. I'm not entirely convinced that's true, but like against decks that have a huge amount of removal and Meathook Massacre, which incentivizes you to cut Goldhound, then maybe it's correct to trim one Facebreaker to bring in other stuff. I'm uncertain if that is correct, but essentially, for the most part, with very few exceptions, you always keep in all of this core package of acceleration cards and only cut Meathook against Meathook Massacre because 3 mana, 4 mana Meathook Massacres just wiping out all of your early stuff is too many eggs in one basket to have be a viable game plan in a matchup that post-board you're probably trying to play a grindy mid-range matchup. And then the other half of the deck that is payoffs, which Facebreaker and Magda sort of pull double duty as both ramp enablers and payoffs, which is kind of why they're the core 2 cards of the deck. So we have Professional Facebreaker and Magda. We have Riveteers Charm in a way, because in matchups that are where mid-range card advantage is payoffs, then Riveteers Charm is a payoff. Ranger class is very slow, but is a payoff in a sense. It's not a great payoff compared to every other payoff in the deck, but it does eventually turn into a payoff if games go long enough, and it's the 2-drop with the most like in-between value of thing that enables Jaspera Sentinel, thing that is a payoff for all of your mana, thing that enables Facebreaker. It kind of just mostly always stays in. I think there are definitely times where you trim one Ranger class, but not terribly often. It's not like super often that there's actually just better stuff to be doing. It's a weird card, but it usually stays in. So then we have the real meat and potatoes payoffs, which are Esika's Chariot and Halana and Alena, which Esika's Chariot plays value and aggro at the same time. Halana and Alena plays value and aggro at the same time. For the most part, Halana and Alena's got some additional value if your opponent's on a bunch of Vanishing Verses and Meathook Massacres, because it insulates your board from those in ways that Esika's Chariot doesn't really against Meathook. We have Goldspan that attacks in the air and makes more mana and treasures for treasure synergies, and Ziatora that does Ziatora things where it's part Ember Cleave, part Mana Dork, part Resource Engine when combined with other cards. And those are the cards that I think you spend most of your, well, that and removal. So removal and top end are the 2 camps that you spend most of the time kind of shaving in different matchups to sideboard with this deck. And then also Goldhound specifically against Meathook Massacre. And like sometimes one Ranger class, but not often. So those are the main camps that give you room to bring stuff in. What you choose to bring in is usually dictated by if your opponent is playing things that you absolutely have to kill, you can bring in Unleash the Inferno, which is mostly just Evelyn in my experience so far. But otherwise, Unleash the Inferno is mostly for runes and matchups with Wedding Invitation, because this deck really suffers against Wedding Invitation gumming up the ground. And then Unleash the Inferno also just has a lot of weird niche value for killing random things that you wind up having to kill. It's not super exciting except against Esper and Runes. So, like, I wouldn't be hyper excited to bring in I wouldn't jump to bring in Unleash the Inferno unless you are playing against one of those decks or the Vampires deck with Evelyn. Most other matchups, Unleash the Inferno is just too slow compared to doing what you are already doing or one of your other sideboard options. Masked Vandal basically only comes in against Runes and Oni Cult Anvil, and when you are playing against those decks, you want both. They are excellent for too many reasons to go over, but bring in two when you're against those decks. I have not yet seen another deck where I felt like Masked Vandal was worth bringing in. Snakeskin Veil comes in when you have an opponent who is playing... Snakeskin Veil usually only comes in if you have random free space and your opponent is playing a game plan where they are trying desperately to interact with you to buy enough time. So it can come in against control decks sometimes. It can come in against mid-range decks sometimes, but mostly only against decks where you are cutting removal. If you are not cutting all of your removal, then I don't really like bringing in Snakeskin Veil. So example, against Esper, I don't bring in Snakeskin Veil because there is too much potential that you are just going to fall behind on board against like a Luminarch Aspirant or a Wedding Invitation, and that your Snakeskin Veil protecting your creatures just isn't relevant. So you don't have enough room to bring in Snakeskin Veil. I've toyed around with bringing in different numbers of Snakeskin Veils against Vampires, and I'm not even completely convinced that's correct. It might be better to just play Voltage Surge, because this deck has a lot of benefit to Voltage Surge enabling you to attack with creatures by virtue of removing blockers. So in a way, Snakeskin Veil is like better than Voltage Surge with your best starts, but with medium starts, Voltage Surge ends up being better, and if you're on the draw, Voltage Surge ends up being better. So I think that against any kind of deck that just plays lots of creatures, it's safer to not play Snakeskin Veil. Riveteers Charm comes in positions where either your opponent has Goldspan Dragon or where you think that you truly need to win a mid-range war because you can't win an aggro war. So, like, I think that Riveteers Charm is, well, good when you need to kill Evelyn, and good when you need to kill Angels that none of your other removal spells are good against, and good against, like, Runes, which is a matchup that typically you have to, like, outvalue in mid-range, which you're equipped to do. And I think that it's good against Esper. I don't know that I would bring in, well, you know, I think that it's safe to say that the majority of the time you're going to bring in the 4th Riveteers Charms, and mostly what differs is that what you're cutting to bring in the 4th Riveteers Charms. I think an interesting scenario is that, like, I don't know if I would bring in the 4th Riveteers Charm in the mirror, because what matters there is, like, completely speed, and Riveteers Charm being 3 mana is a lot, and the draw 3 might be too slow. I don't know if that's completely true, but I think a general safe assumption is that you're probably going to board in 4 of these most of the time. And then Negate and Disdainful Stroke are probably the most interesting cards because a lot of the time that you want to bring them in, you don't necessarily want to bring in all of them. Like, for example, against Esper, I said that I don't want to bring in Snakeskin Veils, and I stand by that. I do want to bring in the 2 Negates, because what happens with Esper is that a lot of the time the ground gets gummed up, and the way you wind up winning is getting your last points of damage in with Goldspan Dragon and Ziatora. Negate protects Goldspan Dragon and Ziatora better than Snakeskin Veil, because it hits Meathook Massacre. It also helps protect you from Wandering Emperor in a way that kind of requires you to play around it, because, like, if you attack with Goldspan Dragon and then Wandering Emperor in response to the attack trigger, then you can't use the treasure that the Goldspan was going to make to save the Goldspan from Wandering Emperor. But It also means that the Wandering Emperor actually gets answered and doesn't stick around and require you to waste time attacking it, like Snakeskin Veil sometimes does. So you need negates to protect your Goldspan Dragons, essentially, from Wandering Emperors and Meat Hooks, and that's just like why they're worth bringing in. They also protect like Esika's Chariots and good board states randomly in ways that Snakeskin Veil doesn't for that matchup, which ultimately makes them worth bringing in. But I don't find Disdainful Stroke to be worth bringing in that matchup, just because you still have to play a density of threats and mid-range cards in that matchup that just doesn't give you room to bring in the Disdainful Strokes. Even though, for the most part, Disdainful Stroke answers all the same things as Negate, but Negate also hits random Vanishing Verses on Goldspan Dragons that otherwise you couldn't hit with Disdainful Stroke, and I don't actually have any threats that cost 4 or more mana that Disdainful Stroke would be good against. Where Disdainful Stroke does come in against is any deck with, like, Hinata, Goldspan Dragon, Magma Opus, Titan of Industry, Burn Down the House. Oh, Wedding Invitation is a different card from Wedding Festivities. Yes, Wedding Announcement. Wedding Announcement. Yeah. Hopefully everybody realizes what I meant. So similarly, there are also times where you only bring in the 3 Disdainful Strokes. Like, I think that there's a potential justification that against some versions of Goldspan combo, you might not necessarily bring in the negates, because there's just not a lot of meaningful things to negate. You want to keep a certain density of aggressive cards, in which case you would bring in Riveteers Charms, Snakeskin Veils, and 3 Disdainful Strokes, because they're the maximum amount of disruption with the lowest opportunity cost, while still clocking your opponent as much as possible. Because, like, in that case, you get to cut the... Let's make a copy of this. So, like, in that case, you would bring in the Disdainful Strokes, bring in the Snakeskin Veils, bring in the Riveteers Charms, cut all the removal, other than Riveteers Charm. And then I think what you are most likely to do is trim the cards at the top end. Sometimes I think there might be a justification to having Ziatora, but for the most part, I think that it's kind of overkill against those decks. Your objective is actually not to, like, race to tapping out for a big threat. It's more to flood the board with a bunch of tiny threats and mana, and just never give them an opening once they have access to 5 mana. So, like, playing Goldspan Dragon and Esika's Chariot or Halana and Alena when they're at, like, 3 mana, or threatening to get up to 4 mana, I guess I should say, is fine. But then there's this weird period in the middle of the game where they're, like, on 5 to 7 mana, where you can't play a Goldspan Dragon or an Esika's Chariot or a Halana and Alena unless you're going to be representing Disdainful Stroke after playing it, which is admittedly easier with Goldspan Dragon, which is why I think that it's something that I'd be more willing to keep in before Esika's Chariot. But there is a weird thing about this deck, and especially Goldspan Dragon, where, like, there are enough targets for Disdainful Stroke that your control opponents are likely to keep Disdainful Stroke in, so you have to be really careful about actually tapping out for Goldspan Dragon, because if they Disdainful Stroke your Goldspan Dragon and you don't have Disdainful Stroke mana up, you might just lose against Storm. So I think that it's pretty important to, like, just trim top end as much as possible and go very heavy on low end stuff. This is more so against Storm. If I was playing against, like, a Hinata list, I think I would probably trim another Halana and Alena, and either Goldspan Dragon or Chariot. I'm not entirely sure which. Probably Chariot. And then just bring in the 2 negates. And the core idea here is just that between Riveteers Charm, Facebreaker, and Magda, you're going to outvalue what they're doing eventually. Actually, I changed my mind. I would play the 4th Chariot against the Hinata lists, because the modern Hinata lists are, like, on a billion 1-drops that are pretty good against most stuff except for Facebreaker. And Esika's Chariot is probably more value against that kind of game plan than Goldspan Dragon. Probably. I don't know. That's pretty close, but you're essentially just trying to go over the top with your low drops and either just win the game by playing lots of card advantage low drops and then protecting them, or get so much of a mana advantage off of unanswered low drops that you get to play your higher drop cards without tapping out and allowing your opponent to resolve a Hinata or a Magma Opus. So I think that's, if not an exhaustive list of how you should sideboard in every matchup, at least a close to comprehensive list of the different types of sideboard packages and sideboard postboard plans that this deck has. And hopefully, I think most importantly, somewhat illustrative of the thought process of how the deck is trying to play postboard. Because, again, to reiterate, I feel like handing somebody a sideboard guide with this deck is terribly not that useful, because the sideboard plans with this deck are entirely based around playing the deck totally different and making decisions different post-board to support the plan. So, like, you actually have to understand the plan, or else the sideboard guide is useless because it's not actually getting played as, like, this holistic whole. Alright, that's everything I had to say, I think.